said we were going to be back in the lectionary. Well, today's that first day. We're back into it. Hence the title, which I thought was kind of catchy. Every week I try to make the sermon to, get a little giggle out of Marianne Napoli, said the champion, because she sees them every week. So this week's called Fish and Trips, which I thought was kind of cool. But anyway, Janine and I were out to dinner recently. The waiter came up to us after we were done and asked me if I'd like to have a box for the leftovers. And I said, no, I don't think so, but I'll wrestle you for it. Come on, people, box. All right. But same thing, Janine asked me to stop eating leftovers out of the fridge. And I was like, oh man, that's really hard to go cold turkey. Stop the cold turkey. No? Okay. Just a groan. I got a courtesy.
They get better, right?
I told first service that I was excited about sharing these jokes with you all, because I said at least second service gives me like a courtesy laugh, but not today, man, not today. Tough crowd. Let me ask this then. This might be easier. What makes for a good dinner party? Is it the food? Yeah. Some, sure. Is it the decor, the ambiance? Maybe a little. Is it the guest list? Oh yeah, to a large degree it is, right? Is it the host? Well, the host makes it all possible. But what really is? What really makes a guest party? I suspect it's probably a combination of all of those things. This week's gospel, as we just heard, takes one of those memorable meal moments that Jesus had, and he had more than one. After hearing the somewhat gruesome recounting of the details of the death of John the Baptist, who was Jesus' cousin, Jesus was pretty upset by that, especially the way it happened, right? Kind of a vengeance thing in the way it happened. So he wanted some alone time. So it says he withdrew, right, from the crowds that were pressing in on him. And the crowds always did press in on Jesus because he had power, he had charisma, he had dunamai, which is Greek for power. He had the power to heal, so of course there's going to be a ton of people always around him. He needed some alone time, so he traveled to what he thought was going to be a deserted place. But like so many other times when Jesus would try to get away from the crowds, it didn't work. The crowds tracked him down and kind of descended on him. They even beat him to the destination. By the time he got there, they were already there. Somebody spilled the beans. So instead of solitude and prayer, which he really needed, he got a little more on-the-job training. Instead of silence and prayer, it says he had compassion for the people, and he healed their sick. And I suspect healing their sick took a long time, because I think there was a lot of sick people. Evidently, Jesus' disciples caught up with him as well. They got there just in time to point out another disturbing issue to their master, and it's actually kind of surprising that they showed as much compassion as they did, because undoubtedly they were really hungry too. So it's kind of surprising they just didn't think about themselves. But they came to Jesus and they said this is a deserted place and the hour is late. Send the crowds away so that they can go into the villages and buy food for themselves, right? It would be like if we had a giant gathering here and everybody was hungry. It'd be like, well, I don't know, go to 7-Eleven or go to, Albertsons right there. Jesus then had a surprising comeback to the disciples. I don't know what they were expecting him to say, but I don't think they were expecting him to say this. Jesus said to them, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. Oh man, I don't know what they thought at that point. You give them something to eat. In other words, he was saying to his disciples who had been traveling with him all this time, you fix it. You fix it. Jesus' disciples didn't get to punt, drop back 10 and punt to somebody else. Jesus directs them, you do it. You feed them. You feed them. So the disciples undoubtedly then take the task seriously. They scramble around, they come up with 5 loaves of bread and 2 sad little fishes. I don't know if they were sad, but it's probably what's that fish it's everywhere, it's in abundance. It's like tilapia, that's probably what it was, tilapia, I don't know. That's pure speculation. But five loaves and 2 sad little fishes. Despite that, they did as they were directed. And they brought that meager amount of food to Jesus for, and this is sort of laughable, distribution, right, to this huge crowd. Can you imagine having like 2 stale, frozen Hot Pockets and a bag of tortilla chips, and you've got 40 people in your living room waiting to be fed? That's sort of what was going on here. The disciples brought to Jesus this small amount of food to distribute to this enormous crowd that was really was waiting for dinner. The feeding of the 5,000, as it's misnamed, is a text that celebrates the impossible. That's what it's all about. It's not a story about shaming this large crowd of sort of hangers-on who wanted something from Jesus. It's not a story about what the people, the crowd could do, pony up and all that. This is a straight up miracle story. This is a straight up, it's not possible for man, but it's possible for God. But here's the thing too. The miracle is less about the food at that moment, and it's more about the leftovers. And there was leftovers. We heard that, right? And Janine said it too in the kids' sermon. First, what we need to do though, and we've all heard this probably 100 times maybe, we need to rename the story. Because Matthew edits Mark's version, and he says this, feeding of the 5,000, but then he adds one little detail. And those who ate were 5,000 men, besides women and children. So from now on, we should probably call this the feeding of the, let's just say, 15,000. Second, it's a minor miracle that the disciples even had, perhaps they had been hanging out with Jesus long enough to actually have the compassion to say, these people are hungry, instead of just thinking about themselves. Maybe he had worn off a bit on them, that they thought about the needs of this huge crowd. Even if the disciples wanted to shoo the crowds away, first of all, that would have been tough. Second of all, it wouldn't have done anything for their hunger. There's genuine concern expressed here, it sounds like, by the disciples. And the challenge is to feed this immense crowd of people. And it really was sort of unexpected. It's not like they planned a picnic and nobody brought it. It's just nobody probably even thought about it. And then the disciples, they made a reasonable suggestion. The suggestion they made was probably the most reasonable that they could have made. And it was, send the crowds away to nearby villages so they can buy food. Simple, easy peasy. Y'all go. Hey, you can even come back if you want. We'll keep on keeping on with the healing and whatever. But you need to get some food. But that's not what Jesus does. Jesus doesn't let the disciples hand it off like a football to someone else. Jesus simply demands that his disciples give the people something to eat. You give them something to eat. Guess who else that applies to? Us. We're told to do the same thing. We're called to feed the hungry, not tell other people to do it. If somebody comes up to us and says, man, I could sure use a meal, we can do what we can do. Hand them a Subway card, whatever. We don't say, get down, get a job. Go to Victory Outreach. I don't know. Go to Calvary Chapel. Get a job. No, man, that's not what we do. We feed them. We're called to do the same thing. We're called to feed the people. We're called to reach out to the disenfranchised and the lonely. And we're called to share with them, not hand it off to somebody else. Okay? But that's not always easy for us to do either. The first step in this approach is a willingness to receive God's providence and provisions. And that sounds all well and good. But the second step is a willingness to expect God's grace and to expect God's gift, to be able to allow us gifts, to be able to allow us to take that next step and to share. So the disciples had a heck of a lot of faith. Because Jesus said, you give them something to eat and you go find out how. And they gathered a ridiculously inadequate amount of food, but they didn't say, we got 5 loaves and 2 tilapia? No way can we give this to the master. He's going to laugh in our face. But they did it anyway. They faithfully gathered this tiny amount of food and they laid it at Jesus' feet. They gave it to Jesus. But then Jesus turned to the hungry throng that was waiting for a meal. And at this point, they're probably thinking, man, this is not going to happen. We best just get down the road. But then what does Jesus say? He tells them to sit down. If you tell 15,000 people that are hungry to sit down, the chances are you're sort of promising them a meal. In other words, give up any hope of feeding yourself and trust me. Trust God. Trust God to do the impossible. Sit down. Just sit down. It's going to be taken care of. Sit down is meant to recline as you would. You know, I said at first service that it's a beautiful painting, the Last Supper, right? But it's a bit off in its actuality. They don't sit in straight back chairs at the table. They were in things called, what do they call, like pliniums, I think? I forget. But where they would more recline, almost like you're laying on the couch watching the game and they would eat. So that's what Jesus said. Sit down, recline, get ready for a miracle. Imagine how the people looked at each other when they heard these words, though, to sit down, and their stomachs are rumbling, right? But they did. They sat, and they steered their attention to Jesus, and he blessed those 5 loaves and those 2 fish. And they're probably thinking, that's it? That's the meal? Man, oh man. But they sat anyway, and they listened out of faith. And they received the blessing on this tiny, paltry amount of food. Their faith expected them to be fed. Their faith expected them to be fed. And when we meet these kind of situations in everyday life, there's 2 perspectives on how it can go, I guess. The human and the divine. The human perspective, when we're talking about resources and commodities, is this. There's never enough. There's never enough. I don't care how much we have. We live pretty well. I'll say everybody in this room. You're going like, not me, Pastor. I live in a 10 by 10 little shed, and it's horrible. It's hot, and blah, blah, blah. Well, there's always, take a look, go. I guess third world is not a PC anymore, right? You take a look at another country that basically has nothing. Pick one, I don't know. Haiti. We live like kings here, kings and queens, compared to a lot of people in Haiti, right? The human perspective is there's never enough, even when we have more than we need. Not enough food, not enough money, not enough space, not enough energy. Amen to that one, right? And certainly never enough time. Whatever the commodity is, there's never enough from the human perspective. But from a divine perspective, there is always plenty, an abundance, an overflowing of everything necessary for our needs. But the good news is too, God doesn't just provide an abundance. God provides more than enough, an overflowing cup, like our hearts, the Dixie cup, God's grace, the Atlantic Ocean. Ooh, that Dixie cup fills really quick. Then we're called to spread that grace to other people. Our God is a God who loves not only to supply for our needs, but to supply leftovers. Leftovers. There's a huge amount of leftovers that are gathered in these 12 baskets. I don't think these baskets were tiny like our offering plate. I think they were big baskets, and they gathered a ton of food. And the reason why I said the leftovers are more important even than the miracle is because the leftovers are like a memory. The ancient Israelites used to put a stone to remember things. These leftovers, every time they eat them, what would they think about? The miracle that happened, right? So the leftovers were every bit as important as the actual feeding. And after the feeding, Jesus immediately sends his disciples away because he wanted to say something. He wanted to dismiss the crowds. He took it upon himself to show these people what to do with the leftovers. Now, we don't have any gospel record of what Jesus said to the crowd about how they should share those leftovers, but surely, like the meal they had just received, what was left over was shared among the people, on their way home. Perhaps they shared with somebody that was left out or left behind. There was takeout, basically, for the journey home. And every time they would dip into those leftovers, they would recall that moment. You see, God gives us, contrary to the way we may feel sometimes, God gives us an abundance of whatever: food, family, energy, love, faith. In Jesus' ethic of leftovers, we are to share the wealth, not to hoard it, not to hide it. I mean, back there, the temptation might have been to hoard that. Oh, I got a half a basket. Well, I'm just going to keep that for my family. We're not called to do that. It's always tempting to just throw the leftovers out, right? I mean, some people don't even save leftovers. I don't know. I won't ask for a show of hands, but sometimes it's easier to just, nope, toss it. Because at the time, let's say you've had, I don't know, some kind of casserole. At the time, you're like, oh, I don't think I could ever eat another bite of that casserole. So you're just like, no, toss it. Next day, you're like, dang, I wish I had some of that tamale casserole or whatever. But it's easy sometimes to just pitch them, because it takes a lot of time and energy, too, to sort it out, to find a container. By the way, we've lived in the parsonage 7 years. I still have no idea where the Tupperware containers are. They just appear. I don't know where cupboard they're in. I've looked. I swear they're not in there, but we always have them. So you got to find Tupperware. You have to find room to store all this stuff. Well, that's what we're called to do. We're called not only to keep the leftovers, we're called to treasure the leftovers. Jesus did not just feed the multitudes and abandon them. You see, that's what he could have done. He could have fed them and just said, all right, you're good to go. But the concept of leftovers and the abundance is what he wanted to point out to them. He gave them doggy bags, basically, to take home that would really solidify what had happened that day. Every time they dipped into that basket or that bag, he provided ongoing nourishment for those people that had sought him out and experienced the healing and heard the words and felt his presence. He basically provided the leftovers as a sort of a glass case exhibit for the goodness of God. Look at that. You walk into a place and something's in a glass case, more likely it's something that's kind of valuable. I used to have them in my bookstore. I'd have all the expensive books in there. Jesus provided a glass case exhibit to all these people for the goodness and the abundance of God. Jesus provided all those who were present at that feast with, pun intended, food for thought, with leftover images as proof for the miracles they had witnessed. Those leftovers were proof of the miracle they had witnessed. These were memories that they could chew on for the rest of their lives, and memories for us also, as we learn to wait on God's provision, because it's mighty. Wait on God's provision, and when it's supplied, never forget to keep to not hoard them, but to treasure the leftovers. In Jesus' name, amen.